Hello everybody, this is Gregory with How I Lost Over 100 Pounds and Kept It Off for 30 plus years, where there should be no hesitance in your weight loss and your weight maintenance. Today we're going to talk about my childhood trauma and have the first installment of what I'm going to call Confessions of an Obese Child. I'll talk about my early childhood trauma and why it led to my disordered eating. Now before we begin, check in the episode notes. I have a link to my website, Naturopathic Earth, that has hundreds of recipes, articles, and the links to the two podcasts here, The Awakened Man and Confessions of an Obese Child. And if you appreciate my content, there's also a donation for PayPal. And if you need help with weight loss, there's a link for Clarity FM if you want to schedule something. Okay, so what I plan to do is do about 30 episodes on what I'm going to call Confessions of an Obese Child, which is also the name of my first book and the name of the podcast, clearly, where I'm going to talk about my personal experiences. And why am I going to do this? Well, some would say that I shouldn't do this because it's revealing a lot of personal stuff, but if you guys know my content, I don't necessarily have a problem with it. And also, look, I think it does help people. I think it does help people when you are honest with your own issues, because it allows people to confront their own issues. So yeah, I'm going to talk about stuff that happened to me as a child, and maybe it will help you and maybe it won't. I do have an episode that I just released on how childhood trauma is one of the most formative reasons why you have disordered eating, why we have disordered eating. So, and I mentioned in that episode I was going to talk about my personal experience. So, my personal experience. I am, and I mentioned this on the 7 things you must know about me, I am originally Mexican. My parents are from Mexico. They were immigrants. They moved here in the 60s. My father was a doctor, and he got a job in America at a cancer hospital, and he moved here. I mean, this shows you how old I am, in the early 60s, and I am the youngest of 3 siblings. My father died, that's why I'm using past tense with him, about 12 years ago. He died suddenly, and we'll have an episode on kind of my issues with my father growing up. My mother is still alive, and for her age, she's in her lower 80s. She's been pretty good in terms of like cognitive, and she's pretty good physically too. She can still walk and so forth. So I am blessed to have still my mother around. Now, as a child, I would tell you that the reason why I turned to food was because I did have a dysfunctional childhood. And I can bring this up because I've brought this up to both of my parents at one point or another, not in a way that was blameworthy. I think early on in my weight loss, so I lost my weight in 1991 or so. In the 90s, I think I was much more antagonistic toward my parents. I'm like, why did you let me eat all this food? Why didn't you just lock it up in a cabinet? We have a future episode on that where they did lock it up in a cabinet and I would break the lock and binge eat. But I'd be like, I'm 4 years old. Why would you just allow me to eat all the food I want? And my mom would be like, well, mijo, I mean, this is what you wanted. And then you would whine and nag about it. But it was like, there's no boundaries. I was never like really reprimanded. I was essentially like Augustus Gloop from Willy Wonka. But I did go through that period of like, I was a little kid, why did you indulge in all the things I wanted? I needed discipline, I needed all these things, and certainly I didn't need unlimited amount of food in my life. But as I got older, I stopped having that view, and eventually I got to the point where, there's that kind of phase of like, you have the victim mentality that should eventually morph into the survivor mentality and then the thriver mentality. So I think early on I was in that kind of victim mentality. Why God, why this, why me, why my parents, you guys are bad parents, da-da-da-da-da-da. And I would have this phase in conversation, but eventually I outgrew that, so to speak, and I was able to have good conversations with both of my parents, in particular my father, before he died. So my childhood, my father, very functional, brilliant doctor. Functional and brilliant. He wrote 34 books, 2,500 articles, and was the head of the American, Latin American, and European society of his branch. I'll just leave it vague. In different times of his life, he was one of the foremost doctors of his branch of medicine. of the 20th century. He was quite formative, to the point where my eldest brother changed his name, because my eldest brother was a junior. He changed his name because he couldn't live under the shadow of my father. So my father was brilliant. Now, my father suffered from alcoholism. My grandfather was an inveterate alcoholic. This is pretty common in Mexico. There's a lot of drinking going on in Mexico, and not to say it doesn't happen in other countries. But my father grew up in an environment where drinking was normal. My father had intergenerational trauma. On his 3rd birthday, his mother left him and his 2 other siblings. He had 2 siblings as well. On his birthday, his mom just walked out on their family. And part of the reason was because his father was an alcoholic, and she was, probably was getting abused under the influence, and she couldn't handle it. So imagine on your 3rd birthday, your mom walks out on you. So there were things in his life that led to him to turn to the bottle, for sure. So he was a brilliant man, but had demons. He had demons. And so when I came around, I was the youngest of 3. He was the Jekyll and Hyde alcoholic. Now, some of you can relate to alcoholics. You know that some of them are just the unfunctional alcoholic, the Barney from The Simpsons, that just drink all day and can't hold down a job. Then you have the functional alcoholics that can hold down a job. My father was a functional alcoholic. He could do his job at work with no problem. He could drive under the influence with no problem. As far as I know, I don't think he ever had a DWI in his life. When my mother and I knew, he had alcohol stashed all in different places in the car. And then, of course, he would have mouthwash in the car as well. And we'll talk about this more in my episode on Standing Alone with My Father. But my father was a Jekyll and Hyde alcoholic. And what do I mean by that is, many occasions he was very normal, sweet. He was the head of the soccer coach for my team as a kid, before I got too fat where I couldn't play soccer or baseball. He would take me to church. He would take me to Adoration Chapel, which is a Catholic thing. He would do all these things. But then when he was under the influence, he would rage and say extremely horrible things to me and to my mother that no doubt affected me as a child at 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old. So you had this Jekyll and Hyde. So when my father would come home, we just didn't know what we were going to get. You just didn't know. And some of you can relate to this. You just didn't know what you were going to get when one of your parents came home. So I was dealing with that, just the vicissitudes of having an alcoholic father. Now, if you talk to my brother, I have 2 older brothers. One of them would say that my father was never an alcoholic. My other brother would say that he was definitely an alcoholic. My mother would say he was an alcoholic. So that does lead to some, we don't have conversations about this. I think I have a very balanced view of my father, and my other brother doesn't think he's an alcoholic, has that kind of lionized view where you can't speak poorly of your parent, because if you do, or criticize anything they did, because if you do, then that is disrespectful to them, and it topples the kind of apotheosis of the parent. I don't have that view. I think that we're all sinners and saints, and we all struggle in different ways. And to acknowledge that a parent had an issue on some level doesn't make them any less or better of a person, because we all have our own demons. So I have a very kind of full flesh view of my father. He was a great man, but he had demons. My mother is not a maternal woman. She was never a maternal woman. I think some of this stemmed from her own childhood. Again, it's always childhood trauma, where her father was exceedingly aloof and suffered from depression. He was a doctor as well. He was a small town doctor back in Mexico. And my mother, I think, kind of grew up with that level of depression in her life, and just, it was a very kind of stoic family, not a lot of emotion. And she dealt with a lot of rejection growing up. She had 5 other siblings, and half of them were sent to Guadalajara for schooling. The other half stayed behind in the small town of Jalisco, where she was from. She was one of those who stayed behind. And I think that affected her. And I think she was just a very sensitive girl growing up. When she got older, she met my father. My father was 5 years older, and he was an up-and-coming doctor. And he was a major catch. And so she married him, and then they moved later to America. And I think with my mother, she always dealt with depression, always dealt with depression. And I think some of it stems from, and she would admit this, moving to another country where you don't know anybody, don't have any friends, and it was difficult for her. And originally my father had told her, we're just moving here to America for a little while, and eventually we'll come back to Mexico and I'll practice practice medicine over here. But he never did, because he was working at a hospital that's one of the top 2 in his field, and he never left, so he always stayed in Houston. So I think that has something to do with it. I think she just always was one of those just kind of melancholic women. So growing up, she was always on antidepressants. She went to psychoanalysts, Freudian psychoanalysts, all through my childhood. And so my mother, in short, was just non-maternal and more focused on her depression. And I remember conversations that my father would have with me. He's like, Mijo, your mom is going to, just go away for a little while. Your mom is going to, just leave her alone. So my mom was always immersed in her stuff. And then my father was the up and down. So growing up, this is what I had. I didn't have a lot of nurturance from my mother. She was immersed in her problems. And my father would give me nurturance when he wasn't raging at me, but when he was raging at me, it was pretty horrendous. So as a 4 or 5-year-old, I didn't have the nurturance, so I turned to food. Food numbed the pain. Food gave me comfort. Food doesn't yell at you. Food doesn't rage at you. Food gives you comfort. Now, on one level, you even know at 3, 4, 5 years old that this isn't a good coping solution. But at the time, you need something. And so since I wasn't getting nurturance from my family, I turned to the easiest thing that was accessible, which was food. It wasn't booze, it wasn't porn or anything like that. It was food. So I numbed the pain. So that was the dysfunction I had. And so probably around 4 or 5 years old, I started doing this. And then by the time I got to elementary school, and we'll have a lot of episodes on elementary school experiences, I knew I was fat because kids would call me fat. And so that just fed the self-loathing and fed the eating, right? Oh, I'm fat, how do I cope with it? Eat. And then just boo. And as you've seen in the introductory photo, and hopefully by the time this video comes out, I'll fix the pod art or the art, the YouTube art on the top, where you can see what I look like. So in closing, like I mentioned in the childhood trauma video that I did, not everybody is overweight because of an experience like I had. You might be overweight for another reason, maybe adult issues, maybe it's metabolic, maybe it's whatever. For me, these confessions of an obese child videos I'm doing, I'm just talking about my experience, so perhaps some of you can relate to it. But I'm not saying just because I had this, everybody had it. And I'm not saying that I had this, woe is me, this sucks, or I should just sucked it up. All I'm telling you is I'm going back 40-something years to my childhood and try to explain the genesis of my particular disordered relationship with food. Guys, post in the comments, let me know if you can relate to this, and we'll have a future Confessions of an Obese Child video upcoming. Until next time, take care, God bless, and pray.